Shalom, welcome to this new class of our free Mishna course on your channel, our channel, Capricious Abel. This is journalist Abel Flores, and I am especially grateful for the time you are investing in biblical studies with us, from a Hebrew and academic perspective, to learn the background, mysteries, and context of the biblical data that has come down to us today. As always, I remind you, if you would be kind enough to share the link to this video with your contacts, with anyone who might be interested in these teachings so we can grow and reach many more people. Also, give us a like, and if you haven't already, subscribe to our channel and activate notifications so you receive messages every time we publish a new video. The link to this video can be shared through WhatsApp groups, Facebook, text messages, and any of the social networks of your choice. We'd also like to inform you that all of our content at Capricious Abel is also produced in English. So if you could also help us promote and share these videos with our English-speaking siblings, it would be a great help. With that said, let's get ready to begin our class. Kadima, onward. Now, let's begin today's lesson. Mishnah Berakhot 2.6 says, Rabban Gamliel bathed on the first night after his wife's death. His disciples asked him, "Didn't you teach us, Master, that a mourner is forbidden to bathe?" He replied, "I'm not like anyone else. I'm delicate." Now, let's do a thorough study of this Mishnah Berakhot 2.6, where we are told that Rabban Gamliel bathed the first night after his wife's death. But his students objected that according to halacha, or rabbinic law, a mourner is prohibited from bathing during the days of mourning. He responded, "I am not like other people. I am istanis." This is the original word used here, and it's a Hebrew term meaning delicate or hypersensitive. Okay, before we begin, let's put all of this back into context. This is a Mishnah that once again mentions Rabban Gamliel, and as we've already said, every time Rabban Gamliel is cited, the greatest sage of his generation, hence his position as president of the Sanhedrin. The background here is the jurisprudence between the barriers created by the rabbis to protect the fulfillment of the Torah of Moses and the limits that the Torah of Moses itself establishes for fulfilling its commandments. However, there are two problems to resolve here. First, what is the problem here with bathing on the first night of the week of mourning? And second, if we have just studied in the previous Mishnah that Rabban Gamliel recited the Shema on his wedding night, how is it possible that we are immediately told of his wife's death? Let's start by answering the second question. The context of what is being discussed here is that it concerns the death of his first wife. And his disciples are recalling that when his first wife died, Rabban Gamliel bathed on the first night of his week of mourning for the death of a loved one, since this is a rabbinic commandment and he is in poor health. So now we know that the Mishnah we studied earlier, 2.5, with the exception of the groom reading the Shema at his wedding, is Rabban Gamliel's second marriage. So, we now know that he was already an old man at that time. He remarried in his old age, and this could be one reason why he was able to read the night Shema on his wedding night, because he was neither a fledgling nor nervous with his partner, and was already an old man without the vigor of youth. So, that's why he was able to have the kavanah, or correct intention of the heart, when reciting the Shema even on his wedding night, because he wasn't nervous. To better understand everything being discussed here, we need a basic introduction to the laws of mourning according to Judaism. The general framework is as follows: 7 days of mourning from the burial, not from the death. The mourners bound by these laws of mourning are known in Hebrew as shiva, which means 7, for the 7 days of the week of mourning. The direct mourners are father, mother, son, daughter, brother, sister, and spouse. This is why Rabban Gamliel held a shiva, because his wife from his first marriage had died while they were still married. After Rabban Gamliel was widowed, he remarried, and at this wedding, the Mishnah cites that he recited the Shema on his wedding night. But what is the purpose of 7 days of mourning according to the Torah? Create a space for retreat, reflection, and community support to assimilate everything that happened and try to grieve and remember the deceased. According to Judaism, one must grieve and remember all these feelings after the death of a loved one during the 7 days following the burial. I repeat, starting from the burial itself, not from the moment of death. All of this will mark a turning point in the lives of the mourners, allowing them to move forward in life. We must grieve in order to laugh later, as the book of Kohelet or Ecclesiastes says. But what are the main restrictions during the shiva? It is forbidden to engage in work or business activities. Personal hygiene and bodily pleasure are prohibited. No bathing or perfume for pleasure. It is permitted for hygiene as a minimum necessity. Regarding clothing, do not wear freshly ironed or laundered clothes. Simple, inelegant clothing is usually worn. Footwear, leather is prohibited. Simple shoes are worn, similar to Yom Kippur, where neither leather shoes nor leather belts are worn. Marital relations are prohibited. Hairstyling and shaving are suspended. What are the mourning practices during those 7 days? Sitting on the floor or on low benches, a symbol of dejection. Covering the mirrors in the mourner's home, avoiding vanity, emphasizing introspection. Lighting a memorial candle, neshama, which means soul candle in Hebrew. Meal. The first meal after the burial is not prepared by the mourners, but by the community or neighbors. This is known as a great mitzvah or commandment that neighbors and friends prepare the Sudat Havra, or comfort meal. The mourner does not initiate any greetings. He only answers briefly out of courtesy, because even in grief, respect for one's neighbor is very important. And what is the liturgy like in the community? A minyan must be held in the mourner's home. 10 adult males gather to pray there instead of in the synagogue for those 7 days. Mourner's Kaddish, recited at Shiva and for the following 11 months by a father or mother, or in shorter periods for other family members. The Kaddish is one of the most important prayers in Buddhism and may only be recited with a minyan, or group of 10 Jewish men. We will study it in detail later. Visits of comfort. Nikam Avelim, the community visits the mourner, sits in silence, or offers words of support. The traditional formula is, may God comfort you among the other mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. But what are the attenuations and exceptions? Because there are always some, as we have consistently taught in this course on the Holy Mishna. Shabbat within the shiva, the external signs of mourning are suspended, but the shiva continues and is counted as one of the 7 days. In other words, Shabbat is so sacred that the mourner must dress in Shabbat clothes and wear perfume. In other words, they must do everything externally, but their mourning continues internally, without shaving or showing joy. On the major holidays, such as Passover, Shavuot, Sukkot, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, the shiva is immediately interrupted. When we study these holidays at the Seder or in the Mode section, you will understand many things. These holidays have a spiritual power that goes far beyond this world. That's all I can tell you. But what happens if there is a medical need or physical suffering on the part of the mourner? Then certain flexibilities are allowed, for example, minimal hygiene or istanis. So, to conclude this brief introduction to the laws of Shiva, or weekly mourning in Judaism, we say that the Shiva seeks to accompany the grief without turning it into self-punishment. The mourner withdraws from everyday life, but they are not alone. The community enters their home, is always with them, and they are practically never left alone, so they don't become depressed and do anything stupid. Mourning is ritualized. There is a limited time for grief, and then they are invited to return to life after that week of mourning. But now, let's contextualize the laws you already know about weekly mourning with the Mishnah we are studying today in Berakhot 2.6. Here, the underlying halakhic problem is the basic rule. During Shiva, the mourner may not bathe for pleasure. This prohibition is formulated and discussed in the Talmud in Mode Katan 15v. The Gemara of Berakhot 16b explains Rabban Gamliel's conduct in our Mishnah with 2 key points. First, the nighttime mourning of the first day is of rabbinic origin, derived from the verse, "His end will be like a bitter day," written in the prophet Amos 8 verse 10. And second, for a delicate or istanis, no additional physical suffering is decreed. In short, Rabban Gamliel did not annul halacha, but acted within a recognized framework. You have to understand that when a tzaddik, a righteous man, an important rabbi in the generation is seemingly changing a halacha by not fulfilling it, there is a background, a teaching that will elevate the Torah to a higher level. But if you don't know the Mishnah, the oral tradition that is the context of the Torah, of the Bible, then you will miss the hidden treasures in the context of the biblical text. Another topic we need to delve into in this Mishnah is precisely where jurisprudence and regulations are created that have accompanied rabbis for centuries in legislating in their communities. What is an istanis? An istanis, also known as an istanis, is a Hebrew term derived from the Greek asthenes, meaning not strong or weak, that describes a person who is overly sensitive, delicate, fussy, or fastidious about their health, environment, and diet. In Talmudic law, an istanis may be granted special indulgences, such as allowing a grieving person to bathe during the mourning period, as they feel too uncomfortable enduring the usual restrictions. The term is also used colloquially to refer to someone who is particularly meticulous about their cleanliness and order. But what are the key characteristics of an istanis? Physical sensitivity. They are particularly sensitive to physical discomfort, such as cold, and may find certain situations worsened by unpleasant encounters. The demand is that they tend to be very particular about their health, diet, and cleanliness of their surroundings. There is a self-perception that they may perceive themselves as weak or delicate. As we already explained in mourning customs, generally, a mourner is prohibited from bathing during shiva, 7 days of mourning. However, an istanis who feels extremely uncomfortable with this restriction is permitted to bathe, as long as it does not bring them pleasure. But there are also dietary needs, and istanis may have specific food preferences or sensitivities. Because there are health concerns, according to a Talmudic account, during the Yom Kippur fast, a high priest who is istanis could be allowed to wash with lukewarm water. What is its modern use? Today, the term is used informally to describe someone who is very particular and sensitive about their environment and personal hygiene. Some scholars suggest that the term can encompass various sensitivities, potentially including conditions related to obsessive-compulsive disorder, which broadens the scope of halakhic indulgences. Rashi defines istanis as a spoiled or delicate person, mianag umefunek, hypersensitive to physical discomfort and dirt. Rabban Maimonides, in his commentary on this same Mishnah we are studying, interprets it as someone cold-bodied, a reading that attempts to anchor the term in the Hebrew root sina, cold. Modern philology and rabbinic lexicography prefer the Greek origin asthenes, weak, not strong, which is also the basis for its widespread use in later rabbinic sources. There are also Talmudic parallels to the istanis status in other laws. The status is not exclusive to mourning. It is also considered in Yom Kippur/Yoma 3:2, 31b. If the high priest is elderly or istanis, the cold water in the mikveh is tempered with hot water to prevent his suffering, because the Torah does not want you to suffer for fulfilling the commandments. In the Talmud, Sukkah 26a, the principle of mitzter patur min hasukah, one who suffers is exempt from the sukkah, that is, from sleeping in the sukkah in the courtyard of the house instead of sleeping in his room. This illustrates the halakhic sensitivity to human physical anguish. It is not identical to istanis, but points in the same conceptual direction. Neither Judaism nor the Torah imposes supererogatory affliction. Suffering is not living, and as long as you suffer, you are not living the life God intends for you, because when God created man, he created him and placed him in paradise, the Garden of Eden, to enjoy. So stop suffering by fulfilling the commandments, because the Torah is to be lived, not died for. Now, understanding the two contexts that underlie these last two Mishnayot studied in Berakhot 2.5 and 2.6, there is a diptych that contrasts two movements of Rabban Gamliel: personal rigor, where rabbinic law exempts him. He recites the Shema on his wedding night, that is, his second wedding, and flexibility, where rabbinic law restricts him from bathing during his mourning, due to a recognized status, istanis. The common thread is not the leader's arbitrariness, but rather the conscious application of principles, assuming the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. Beyond the minimum, when you have the capacity to fulfill a commandment, even though you are exempt by human law, and avoiding inflicting unnecessary suffering when the norm is rabbinic, and there is a halakhic category that contemplates it. The structure of the chapter emphasizes how personal decisions can coexist with general norms without contradicting them. Bathing for pleasure or hygiene. The Shulchan Aruch distinguishes between washing for enjoyment versus to remove dirt. The Mishnah does not specify this, but classical exegesis sees in istanis a case where not bathing objectively causes physical suffering. Furthermore, we must understand that, in the stories told in the Mishnah, Rabban Gamliel was an old man. What are the practical implications today? During shiva, the mourner typically refrains from pleasure showers if there is physical distress, dermatological problems, minimally necessary hygiene, or the person is truly istanis. There is a normative basis for allowing, with prudence and moderation, the person to bathe or do other things that do not cause suffering. During Shalashim, which is the 30 days of mourning or the month, several Orthodox communities to this day maintain a restrictive minhag or custom for hot water, but many poskim or legislators allow basic hygiene, limited shampooing, etc. when necessary. Berakhot 2.6 teaches that halacha does not seek affliction for affliction's sake, and that rabbinic authority recognizes human variability, such as istanis. Rabban Gamliel's conduct does not break the law, but rather applies principles to it. For example, the initial night mourning on the first day of the week of mourning, or shiva, has rabbinic status. It does not come from a mandate in the Torah of Moses. Instead of suffering, the sages did not decree regulations, lo gazra rabbanin thimkum sayar, and the istanis condition exists, but it requires seriousness and judgment. And as a pedagogical counterweight, I repeat, the Mishnah, Berakhot 2.5, shows that, when it comes to accepting the divine yoke that comes from the Torah of Moses, Rabban Gamliel chooses to be demanding even where the norm of his fellow rabbis exempts him. Together, the two anecdotes outline a halakhic ethic of firmness and compassion. The message here is that to keep the Torah, like the 10 Commandments, you must be strict, but when it comes to customs, rabbinic restrictions, or human laws, you mustn't suffer unduly. While this sounds very nice, in practice it isn't quite so. Therefore, we will continue studying the teachings of the Mishnah, which will delve much deeper into all of this.
Now, look at what we're going to do. We're going to enter a segment of the class that may be very interesting for some, but at the same time annoying for others. But here on this channel, we are neither dogmatic nor religious. We just want to be researchers and curious. We're going to draw a parallel between the Mishnah teachings we've studied from Rabban Gamliel and compare them head-to-head with some of the teachings we read in the Gospels of Jesus or Yeshua. For example, what rigor does Jesus instill in God's commandments? Let's look at the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew 5 verses 17 to 20, Yeshua affirms, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." Even Jesus demands that we go beyond the literal. When he says not only you shall not kill, but that you must avoid anger, this is in Matthew 5 verses 21 to 22. Yeshua also says, not only you shall not commit adultery, but also avoid the desire of your neighbor's wife in your heart. Matthew 5 verses 27 to 28. This reflects the absolute requirement regarding the divine yoke of the Torah of Moses. That is, Yeshua regarding the commandments, you shall not kill, and you shall not commit adultery, which are both from the Decalogue or the 10 Commandments, the most important part of the entire Torah and which was written by God's own finger. There, Yeshua is radical, even extremist, saying that if you even think about your neighbor's wife in your mind, you are already an adulterer. Let us remember that in previous Mishnah we studied that all desires and thoughts, as long as they remain in the mind, as long as they are not realized or acted upon, are neither a mistake nor a sin. This is the teaching of the sages of the Mishnah, but in this Yeshua differs. He is more radical. Why? Because they are the most important commandments of the Torah in the Decalogue. And here, the same rigor is used as Rabban Gamliel in Berakhot 2.5 when reciting the Shema on his wedding night, because he wanted to keep the most important commandment of the Torah, which is the Shema, even above the restrictions imposed by the sages, that is, by men. These are the laws of men. These are key for you when you read, for example, the Apostle Paul or Saul of Tarsus, who was a disciple of Hillel and his grandson Gamliel. Can you now understand the difference between the law of God and the law of men?
But there is also flexibility in the face of rabbinic or human norms, which are the famous fences of the Torah. For example, in Mark 2 verses 27 to 28, Jesus says, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." Here, Yeshua relativizes the rigid rabbinic interpretations of the Sabbath, prioritizing human life and need, because no one can die or suffer for keeping a human commandment. That is a rabbinic regulation. And this is similar to Rabban Gamliel's permission in mourning in Berakhot 2.6, when being obedient justified bathing to avoid suffering. In fact, in Luke 13 verses 10 to 17 and Matthew 12 verses 9 to 13, Jesus heals on Shabbat, even though the Pharisees, now that you know the Mishnah. You now know that these Pharisees were of the school of Shammai and considered healing on Shabbat to be work. Of course, we'll study all of this when we get to the Seder or Mode section or the biblical feasts. Yeshua teaches that alleviating suffering on Shabbat does not violate the spirit of the law of the Torah. Here there is a direct connection with the principle Lo Gazra Rabbanan Dimkum Sayar, not decreeing any rabbinic regulations in place of suffering, that is, creating any suffering. Want more examples? In Matthew 23 verse 4, Yeshua criticizes the Pharisees because they bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne, and lay them on men's shoulders. This is a critique of the Torah restrictions imposed by the house of Shammai, because if you are familiar with the oral tradition found in the Mishna, which has come down to us today from the days of the Second Temple, then you now know that the house of Hillel, that is, the Pharisees, disciples of Hillel, legislated with compassion for a people oppressed by Rome and the poverty of the time. The teachings of the Pharisaic and rabbinic school of Hillel bear many similarities to the teachings of Yeshua. Of course, not everything is the same, but the similarities are striking, especially if you have read the Bible, the New Testament, without its true context, which is the Hebrew perspective compiled in the Mishnah. Jesus demands absolute fidelity to the law of God, but denounces the excessive rigor of traditions added by the rabbis of the school, or house of Shammai. Here is a synthesis that you should learn to first understand the whole spirit of the Torah that is known through the study of the Mishnah, and also to understand the real context of the teachings of proto-Christianity, which is basically first-century Christianity, the original Christianity that was more known as the Nazarites than Christians, but the Mishnah even speaks about them. And we will study them throughout this in-depth and intensive course on the oral Torah compiled in the Mishnah. Jesus and Rabban Gamliel agree on the same logic of interpreting the Torah, at least as far as we've studied it so far in this course. Of course, there will always be exceptions, and you'll be surprised when you learn about them. Between the school of Yeshua and that of Hillel, there is a maximum demand for fidelity to God, fulfilling and even intensifying the divine commandments of the Torah of Moses, such as the Shema and the Decalogue, not to kill, not to covet. On this issue, they are radical. They seek to preserve more or as much as possible. But they do not add unnecessary human suffering with the rabbinic norms or burdensome customs of the school of Shammai. The barriers of the Torah are learned even from Genesis, when the serpent tells Adam that it is forbidden to touch the fruit. That was a barrier of the Torah, but the real, divine commandment was not to eat the fruit. Of course, the logic is that if you don't touch the fruit, then you won't eat it. But the deception was that by touching the fruit, which was not the real commandment, and not dying, then God is seen as a liar. If you know the difference between Torah commandments and rabbinic barriers, you will understand everything much better. Better yet, and the serpent of Eden, who uses the energy of your evil inclination or Yetzer Hara, will not be able to deceive you. That is, you will not deceive yourself. This is the key here, raising your consciousness. In modern terms, rigor in the essentials of the Torah and compassion in the cultural, because culture comes from worship, and worship is idolatry. You also have to raise your consciousness to understand that the commandments of the Torah do need their fences. This will allow you to walk through the garden without spoiling the flowers. Deception, as always, lies in ignorance and confusion. And finally, you must learn this Hebrew concept so that you can learn to interpret the Torah like Hillel, like Gamliel, or like Yeshua. Because learning to interpret the Torah is the purpose of the oral Torah compiled in the Mishnah. In Judaism, Pikuach Nefesh literally means to safeguard life, or to protect life. It is one of the most important halakhic principles and refers to the idea that the preservation of human life is above almost all other commandments. The concept establishes that if a person's life is in danger, it is permissible, and one must, transgress almost any precept of the Torah in order to save it. This includes, for example, desecrating Shabbat, eating forbidden foods, or breaking a fast if health requires it. This biblical and rabbinic foundation is based on verses such as Leviticus 18 verse 5, "You shall keep my statutes and my laws, that a man may do them and live by them," from which the rabbis deduce, "and he shall live by them, not die by them." In the Talmud, the rule is developed that saving a life takes precedence over the commandments, with the exception of 3 sins that may never be committed even under threat of death: idolatry, murder, and incest. This has practical applications in medicine today. A Jewish doctor can, and should, work on Shabbat if necessary to save or protect a patient's life. In emergencies, breaking kashrut rules or fasting on Yom Kippur or breaking Shabbat is permitted if a person's life or health requires it. In social ethics, the principle is also a basis for valuing life above legal or ritual formalities. Neither religion nor faith is above the life of any human being. Pikwach Nefesh is considered a pillar of Jewish ethics. Human life has absolute priority, and protecting life is fulfilling God's will in its fullest sense. See you in the next video.